Hello everyone, welcome to first NSE event of the year. Just a bit about NSE before we begin the talk. We're New School Economics, a society at Goldsmiths that grew out of the philosophy, politics and economics course. We look to hold talks and events that approach contemporary issues of political economy in a pluralistic fashion, using ideas outside of current economic orthodoxy. Whether that's bringing in sociological, anthropological or creative angles, looking at the intersections between economics and issues such as mental health, or like today, looking at economic practices that in our current moment are considered radical. We hope to be putting on a climate conference at the end of the year and other interesting talks between now and then. You can keep up with us on social media. Just look for New School Economics Goldsmiths on Facebook, or find us through the Facebook event for today's talk, or you're welcome to just hit us up after the talk and have a chat with us. Now let me introduce today's speaker, James Meadway. As former economics advisor to John McDonnell, James is someone who is intimate with political economy issues of today and with Labour's vision on how to deal with them. A non-exhaustive list of his other credentials include serving as chief economist at the New Economics Foundation, working at the Treasury and as an associate fellow at IPPR, and writing for organisations such as Novara Media and Tribune magazine. He's also working on a book which should be out sometime. So look out for that. The format for today's event will be around half an hour talk from James, outlining a broad framework for Labour's current economic programme, amongst other economic ideas, followed by time for Q&A and discussion. Whether you're a canvasser looking to sharpen their knowledge of the Labour manifesto or someone who's very critical of Labour policy, we hope you feel welcome to raise questions with our guest. We'd like to thank Will Davies and the Political Economy Research Centre for helping us set this up. We'd like to thank you all for coming, and of course a big thank you to James for joining us during a very busy time.
And thanks very much for the invite to speak. There's been several clashes this evening, not least of which was the leaders' debate on climate change on Channel 4, which Boris Johnson, predictably, because their entire strategy for the election, Conservative Party entire strategy for the election, is to reduce to the bare minimum the amount of contact Boris Johnson has with the public, certainly the public, please can you go home, get out of our town, all that sort of stuff. So certainly the public, specifically sort of anybody in the north of England, as far as I can tell, actually meets him. Broadcasters in general, journalists as a set, and I think possibly just reality itself after a while. In this case, Channel 4 have decided to replace them apparently with a melting block of ice, which is quite amusing, and also well within Channel 4's rights. If you say we will, as Channel 4 is still publicly owned, by the way. Channel 4 is still publicly owned. It's one of these weird things that Margaret Thatcher set up. Bizarrely and probably against a better interest, better judgment in some ways in the 80s, and has remained publicly owned ever since, and occasionally has flashes of the radicalism that once sort of drove the channel back in the day. So they are well within their rights to have a block of ice in the place of PS, the Prime Minister, who doesn't want to turn up in to have a debate with other party leaders in the single most important, with all due respect to people who really fixate on Brexit, this is the single most important thing that could possibly be happening to us from now for the rest of our entire lives, which is climate change. So he doesn't want to talk about that. So they replace him with a block of ice, carved apparently into a likeness of Boris, which is melting slowly in front of us. But what was slightly more concerning is that the government response to this was to threaten to remove Channel 4's licence to broadcast. Now, this isn't the sort of thing that should be happening in what we like to think of as a sort of developed economy, liberal democracy sort of a place, right? That is the set of assumptions that we have about how institutions in Britain should function, how the government should behave. It's the sort of thing that if you go to somewhere like Hungary and you find out how licenses to broadcast are removed over there, or licenses to print, or you happen to try and say something on the internet and suddenly you find you can't, that is the level that you're looking at this point in time. Because to be honest with you, on your list of major offences against the Prime Minister, who was too cowardly to turn up to a debate, placing a block of ice that's slowly going to melt in your place in the debate isn't really that high up. It's your own lookout if you're not prepared to do these things. But to remove a license to broadcast, or even to threaten to remove a license to broadcast, is something quite serious, if that's what is actually going on here. And there's something quite serious throughout the entirety of this election campaign. And I start with this, partly because it's happening as we speak, but partly also because it draws attention to something critically important about the entire moment of what I think the sort of Jeremy Corbyn movement, or the movement around Jeremy Corbyn, represents, and the economics it represents, and why it's there, and why all these sort of stupid predictions that we got about how the election is going to play out, all of this over the summer, that we're going to end up with a four-party split, that suddenly the Lib Dems are going to be forming a government and all this sort of thing. I'm going to stick my neck out at this point, 2 weeks away from the election, and say this isn't going to happen. All these predictions about how everyone was so fed up with, like, oh, Labour's position on Brexit, oh my God, and we just want to return to the safe centre, the normal, back to normal. Matt Chorley, who is the Times, I think he must be political correspondent. You sign up to these email lists and you get an email in your inbox every morning. There's always one that sort of plops in there, apparently from him. And he's running a show called This Is Not Normal, which is apparently how we're supposed to think about this, that all these things that are now happening are not normal. The fact that all of this has basically been happening for 10 fucking years doesn't intrude on the fact that you shouldn't think that any of this is normal. Because this is normal, and the idea that we can go back to a point of safety and centrism and just everything is going to sit there, and all of this kind of creeping back to, like, if only we could get back to the 2012 Olympics, or whichever point you want to pick, then everything seemed all right, that you get from this kind of centre block, which is still there, it still commands some influence, but its sway in British society, I think, is decaying in front of us, is a decisive factor in what's driving this election, and driving, I suspect, the results of this election in the same way it drove the results of the 2017 election. There's an extraordinary polarisation, a very deep polarisation in British society between these two effectively competing blocks for what the shape of that society will look like. And given the nature of our party system, the electoral system we have, it tends to turn into a vote for one block, which is over here, certainly in England and Wales, a vote for another block over here, and two different competing visions. And the gulf between those two different competing visions in this election has become even more marked than it was in 2017. And that reflects a real dynamic in the society we live in that isn't going to go away. And that relatively superficial things, like anybody's position on Brexit or some other sort of relatively not so important events that have happened in the last sort of 10 years since the financial crisis, since this collapse of a specific kind of capitalism that we lived under, or at least the collapse of its dynamic, the collapse of the thing that made it a viable form of government since 2008, is what's driving the polarisation in in this election. And that polarisation, I think, has come out in two ways. Polarisation in the sense of that people move towards one of two alternatives. That you are left with a situation in which the centre does not hold together. It is not possible to simply sit there and say, can we marginally adjust things? You can see this in the polling, very, very sharply in the polling. 60% of people or thereabouts say there should be pretty dramatic changes to how the British economy is governed. 2% of people want to see things stay the same. So you can see that this kind of confidence that things could just continue roughly as they are with minor changes has disappeared in front of us. And with that, parties that basically stand for this are fading away. They'll claim some small part in this because of tactical voting, because of Brexit, because of some intrusions, if you like, in the underlying dynamic, but they're not going to be the main thing. So what does that polarisation look like? I think in two parts. One version of it, I think increasingly seriously over the last few years, is roughly what Boris Johnson pretends not to represent but does represent, which is a response to 2008, a response to basically the failure on a catastrophic scale of a neoliberal version of capitalism, particularly in this country, also in America, really across the developed sort of the old West, the global North in general. And the more a country had sort of pursued a neoliberal path, the worse the failure became. If you're in Britain, where you have a very deep pursuit of a neoliberal form of economic governance, that you stripped away most of, with some exceptions, but a great deal of what had been built up over the post-war period as a sort of social democratic consensus. Over many decades this had happened. And you built up this extraordinary version of a kind of debt-led growth, a debt-led kind of capitalism that you deliberately inflated the people just over the other side of the river in the city of London, or their opportunities to create more money out of money dealing, and you'd expect it to be able to rest the entire economy on that. Once all that collapses, it is a catastrophic crisis, which requires incredible effort to overcome, and it isn't settled. It is not in any way resolved coming out of this 10 years later, because the figures speak for themselves. You can go through it in terms of real wages. This is an unprecedented period of decline for most people's living standards. Average real wages today are lower than they were in 2008, a decade ago. Right? They basically haven't improved in that time. They fell and picked up a bit, and now sort of wobbling along again. This hasn't happened since the Industrial Revolution in this country. I don't think it's really happened in peacetime in any major developed economy ever that I can think of. We can maybe think of some examples where there's been catastrophic collapses of economies where something like this has taken place. And look at Russia in recent history. But nothing like this has happened somewhere like Britain. Nothing like this has happened without provoking incredible, or without being the result of most incredible sort of political turmoil. So there's that. There's this decay of the public sphere, the austerity, which is a response to the crisis, is inflicted. There's the underlying dynamic of, or lack of dynamic, which is the collapse of productivity growth. I mean, this is directly related to the decline in real wages, but the collapse of productivity growth and its stagnation. But productivity growth matters, by the way. If you look at the history of capitalism over the last 200 years, why is it still there? Why does it change the world? Because basically it's more efficient at doing things than any other kind of form of human society that we've ever discovered. And it does that for a very long period of time, and it's not just more efficient at doing things, it becomes more efficient at becoming more efficient. So you get growth. So you get new technology that you can apply. The economy grows, and because the economy is growing, you can kind of give more money to most people. And over a long period of time, over the 200 years, suddenly living standards are transformed. This is the dynamic of capitalism. If that isn't there, if productivity growth isn't improving, if efficiency isn't improving, then you are suddenly in a world where capitalism itself is not working very well. That is what we've had in this country. You can stack all of this up. None of this is working. And it's visibly producing a society, visibly, that once you step outside of some hot spots, mostly in the major cities, you can still wander around London, not so much around Lewisham perhaps, but you can wander around bits of London and think, actually, this is reasonably prosperous, this is reasonably successful. You kind of have to, turn your eyes away from the extraordinary spread of homelessness that's taken place. But once you go to outside of London or central Manchester or central Bristol, maybe this sort of thing, and don't go too far away actually, once you go to some of the smaller towns, once you go to some of the places that haven't seen, they've spent 40 years not really seeing investment, but really seeing the effects of austerity over that period of time, you're suddenly looking at high streets where it's boarded up shop, charity shop, chicken shop if you're lucky, boarded up shop, that's your high street. That's what this looks like. This is a society and a form of economy in a clear and obvious state of decline. And the question you then get confronted with, after 10 years, it is almost 10 years of this, is what do you do about it instead? And I think what's becoming apparent is that one version of it is the version that Boris Johnson has but doesn't want to talk about. It's embedded in the trade deal they want to sign with the US. It's rattling around in some of the wilder imaginations of some of his cabinet ministers, which is to pursue a sort of national version of neoliberalism, a version of neoliberalism when you've given up on the world economy growing or whatever, but you're going to try and reduce everything possible in this country to a bare minimum. You strip out all costs you can get rid of. So the NHS is a cost, so you get rid of it. Cost to business, you get rid of it. You get rid of protections on people at work, because it's a cost, you get rid of it. You get rid of protections on environmental measures, because it's a cost, so you get rid of it. And then you strip all of this out, and then you're left with, in theory, a much more dynamic, go-getting Singapore-on-Thames style society. You say Singapore-on-Thames, they never throw in the bit about, all the land is nationalised and that sort of thing. But anyway, Singapore-on-Thames is the fantasy version of that. And that is rattling around as one possible solution to a very, very obvious and deep crisis of capitalism in Britain. The other version of it, I think, has become centred around around Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party and what it represents and what it's trying to do. And that's really what I wanted to sort of get into talking about, and where I think we're going from here, and why I think it represents a solution to all this. Because the first one, if we think about what is Corbynomics, you can see actually the manifesto, the Labour manifesto, is a pretty clear sort of representation of, obviously it's a manifesto of what Labour and government would want to try and do, but it's also a statement of intent about the kind of society you want to build and where you want to get to out of this. And I think there's probably, let's say 3, maybe 4 points that are sort of animating this, ways to think about the organisation of what's going on here. The first one is simply an attempt to repair the damage of the last 10 years or so. That if you say you want to end austerity, it's not hard to say this and to see why this would be a desirable thing to do. Like, that is the argument we've had since Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party in 2015. And I think it's an argument that, at least on the level of what we want to talk about, it's been won. If you go through now what the Conservatives are saying, there's an incredible cynicism about it, but they will say, they said under Theresa May that they're ending austerity. Under Boris Johnson, they are now claiming to also put some money into ending austerity, which you think might be key to the thing. The fact is, if you look at the figures they produce, austerity is basically permanently baked in to any future projections of what they want to do, with the exception, perhaps, of healthcare spending, which is politically sensitive for them. That ending austerity becomes your first port of call. That's the first thing you do. But if you want to end up in an economy with, or in a society with a public realm that functions, with a public, the fact that you have public services that are of the standard that people expect, that it isn't just you kind of scraping on through this miserly existence, that you aren't actually in a world where everything is you have to fight for it and get something. You want a public sector which is expansive, which provides things for people. Then you have to increase funding for these things, and you have to do it in a fairly substantial way, and that's what's built into the manifesto. It's the same as 2017. You increase public spending. And you increase public spending very specifically on the basis of, and I think this is politically important that this is done, on the basis of making clear to people that we're going to redress the inequality in British society. We're going to say that people, basically the top, not the super rich necessarily, but the top 5% are going to pay for this. We're going to ask large corporations to pay for this, and this is what we're going to provide for the expansion of the public realm. Now, noting this, because this is the second point I think that animates a lot of the sort of conception of what a good or better society might look like, and certainly a better economy, is that this is a movement away from the version of that redistribution you might see under New Labour, or became to be associated with New Labour. Because when New Labour is in office, there's the underlying problems that New Labour had were that it was relying on a continual expansion of debt in order to grow the rest of the economy. If you keep on borrowing, then you can make your economy grow. Because everyone's borrowing money, so you spend money so the economy grows. The problem is when you have to repay the money. That's the short version of what went wrong for New Labour. That's what it was based on, but it did involve a redistribution. So, actually, there's a set of people out there who say it was incredibly redistributive relative to other governments. They tend to think this is a good thing. I'll come on to this point, or I'll develop this point, but to be honest with you, you can easily say that if you have lots of redistribution, that's a failure of your economy, because you have to redistribute. Your economy should be producing good outcomes already. You shouldn't have to have a government that turns up and redistributes out of this. But the New Labour version of this was to have a kind of debt-led version, or debt-fueled version of growth. That growth produced outcomes that were not necessarily particularly equal, and then you skim a bit off the top, particularly from financial services, and redistribute to everybody. But that redistribution came attached to forms of means testing, forms of saying, well, actually, it's a bit miserly, you can have a bit, but really we're going to try and push you into behaving in a certain way to get these things. That it was never about the provision of universal benefits, or universal basic services, to use a sort of Corbynite jargon on this. It was never about saying, look, here is something for everybody. Here is an expansive idea of the public realm, that we're all part of this society, here is the riches of this society, everyone can take part. So university education, it's the New Labour that introduces the idea of having to pay for university education, have to pay for education. What happens under successive Conservative governments is those steps taken by New Labour when they were somewhat increasing public spending, so therefore it doesn't necessarily look too bad, it's not great, but it doesn't look too bad. Once you start shrinking public spending, means testing turns into a slow form of torture. Right? Introduction to universal credit, the way in which people are forced to jump through hoops to prove, almost literally, to prove how disabled they are before they can get this crap handout at the other side. It becomes a form of torture. So instead of that, you say, look, we have a different version of what the public realm, what a good society looks like. It involves universalism. It involves giving something to everybody, because you're here and you can take part in this. You set up a national education service because everybody should have access to education for free. You do this, and you build it on the same basis as a national health service. And if there's some people who are better off who can access this, fine. You have a tax system that's fair, so you can make sure that they are contributing towards providing these services. You step out of a world in which all public services are kind of, police can I have some more sort of penny pinching, and into a world of saying this is an expanded public realm. And to make that happen, we'll have a tax system which asks some people at the top of society to pay a bit more for it. So that's the kind of public sector vision of it. The steps beyond that point, where you move beyond even what a sort of leftish version of New Labour might have contemplated, or at least actually did in practice, is when you start to say, look, why do we have such low productivity in Britain? Why, in very crude sort of capitalist terms, do we have low productivity in Britain? The simplest explanation is that we have a very low rate of investment. Investment by government and investment by businesses. What has happened since 2008, and there's a very good paper by John Van Reenen, who at the time was at the LSE, he's moved to MIT now I think, very good paper on what has happened since 2008 is basically British firms have substituted investment in capital, in new technology, in new buildings, factories, whatever. They've substituted that because they don't really need to, because they can get access to cheap labour, cheap, insecure labour and stuff. And if you're doing the cheap labour thing, you're not doing the investing to make productivity improvements over time thing. You're just not. You're taking a very short-term view of the future. You end up with just creating loads and loads of rubbishy jobs over here, very insecure, very poorly paid, lots and lots and lots, and on a vast scale. I mean, this is what's happened since 2008. That's an absence of weakness in investment. But it's not just about saying firms aren't investing enough, it's also government doesn't invest enough. British government invests, it's about 2.9%, it's a bit less than that actually, it's about 2.5, 2.6% GDP in infrastructure and capital spending as of last year. That's up ever so slightly because the Tories started to panic about this from its absolute nadir a few years ago. This is incredibly low relative to other developed economies. It means, it starts to explain why it is that the trains don't work properly. Why, if you go to the north of England, you're suddenly sitting on these converted buses that were originally built, 35 years ago, that they're still trying to rattle them between Leeds and Manchester, that sort of thing. It explains why, for instance, Britain has strikingly bad broadband access. Even in the middle of London, we have very, very slow rates of internet connections. You can go all over the place. Romania, Bulgaria, both have decisively better internet connections than here because they built the things fairly new. Here it hasn't happened because the investment hasn't happened. And once you start to stack all these things up, that is why you don't get productivity growth. Because if you don't have a capitalism which has access to the infrastructure it needs to become more efficient, to develop new ideas, to do all the things that capitalism is supposed to do, you don't get the productivity growth. So you have to move government investment from its very low level at the minute to something above that. Now, if you saw the Institute of Fiscal Studies report on this, it was sort of initially jumping up and down and shouting about how extraordinary, how huge, how terrible all this. Terrible wasn't quite the word they used, but it was getting in that direction. They seem to have calmed down a bit with their more developed reports today. It isn't really. That investment part, the public spending part of what the Labour manifesto says, basically moves Britain from a relatively very low spending economy, from 39, maybe 40, 39% GDP public spending, very similar to the US, to a level that's somewhere a bit below Germany, more like sort of Sweden. You're moving from a very, very low spending, public spending economy to something a bit like Northern European standard. With investment in particular, because to overcome years, decades of underinvestment across much of the rest of the country outside of a few hotspots, you need to go a bit further in this. The investment moves to just above the OECD average, to about 4% of GDP on the IFS projections. So you do the investment. It's a big turnaround in British terms, because you go from a low public spending, low investment economy to somewhere that's either about the OECD average, sort of Northern European average, maybe a little bit above on the investment spending. And if you do that, you can start to deliver the productivity increases and all the rest of it. You start to basically make capitalism work a bit better. That's what you're doing at this point in time. And once you can deliver that, you're getting into a space where suddenly it becomes possible to deliver serious and long-lasting wage increases, improve standard of living, actually deliver for great swathes of the country that have not seen investment for a long period of time, good, secure jobs, prosperity in people's high streets, all of these things that people want, but hasn't really happened for a good 20, 30, 40 years, not in a serious way. That's what you do. That's the investment part of it. The final bit of it, I suppose, is where you get into looking beyond simply making capitalism work better and into thinking what is a different kind of economy. How could the economy work better for everyone? What is it that we're trying to get to here? And that is the fundamental question of ownership. If you take the two sort of most transformative governments that we've had since 1945, the ones in Britain that have really sort of shifted the paradigm, the economic paradigm, the way people think about the economy, the way the economy operates. They are 1945, Clement Attlee, who, Labour government elected by a landslide then, straight after the Second World War, nationalised, moved into public ownership about 20% of the economy. It's a huge transfer of the ownership of productive resources. They also start the council house building programme. It's a big shift of resources into the public sector, because suddenly everyone can get a council house. So you're no longer reliant, as people were at the time, on private, this may be familiar, on private sector renting. You suddenly can get a good, secure, well-built, actually quite decent council house instead. It's a huge transfer of ownership. And the other one is 1979, which is Margaret Thatcher, which reverses all of this and then goes a bit further, because they sell off council houses, so it's an active transfer back into the private sector. Both of those governments locked in place a different way of running the economy, and they did it on the basis of transfer of ownership. So the bit that starts to lock in what a sort of future, let's say 5-10 years time, Corbynish or Corbynite, or whatever you want to say it, set up for the economy looks like, is one in which ownership is transferred. And you transfer ownership because it starts to give people, it changes people's relationship to how the economy operates in a really fundamental way. Now that doesn't just mean that you move things back into public ownership. There's a programme for nationalisation, for renationalisation, of a whole load of public utilities that should never have been privatised in the first place. So rail, water, energy, that kind of thing, Royal Mail, all move back into public ownership. But it's also looking beyond that point and saying, what can we do to take the productive assets of society and put them in the hands of people who actually produce the wealth, the people who actually ought to be in charge of running this society and making their own decisions about where they live, about where they work, and that sort of thing. About locking in place this radical shift in the balance of power and ownership in how our economy operates. And that is where you get out of simply saying you can either have privatisation or public ownership, and into thinking about, and it's still worth digging out, the paper from 2017 that Labour produced, the Alternative Models of Ownership paper, into sort of common ownership of various forms. Maybe local council, maybe your local council owns some asset, maybe it owns a wind farm. This is starting to happen in a few places. Maybe you as a community have got together to own the same thing. Maybe you've got together to own a wind farm. That can also happen. Maybe you as a group of workers own your workplace. That is something that can happen. You spread the form of ownership. You spread the form of ownership because it starts to lock in place the kind of society you want to build. And this is where it meets up, I think, with what is the cutting edge of all of this, which is the urgent need to decarbonise the economy and to do it in a pretty rapid pace, to meet a target around about 2030 rather than one, as the government says, 2050. And the reason ownership matters to this is that if you want to, it's a sort of simple example of it, but if you want to decarbonise your economy rapidly, the quickest way to do that is get your electricity system to move out of very high carbon production, or relatively less carbon production, like coal or less so gas, and into zero carbon energy or electricity production, so renewables of various sorts. If you're in Britain, the obvious one to go for is wind farms. The cheapest electricity anywhere in the world you can get right now is onshore wind. It's historically proved hard to build onshore wind in Britain because, and this is not unreasonable really, because you have to locate it where the wind actually is, which is often quite windswept, beautiful places. And people there don't necessarily particularly want their nice view or their locality spoiled by just having a wind farm plonked on it, which is not an unreasonable objection. And to be honest with you, they may well object to that whether it's a big private provider of electricity wanting to build the wind farm, or whether it's a big distant public provider of electricity wanting to build a wind farm. But if you can give them ownership over that wind farm, ownership over those turbines, so they kind of own and control the thing and get the benefits out of it in the form of revenues, suddenly that shifts people's perceptions of how you can do this. If you want to decarbonise rapidly, if you want to move our electricity system from relatively high carbon output to low or zero carbon output, if you want to do it rapidly, the cheapest, quickest way to do that is onshore wind. The easy way to get onshore wind built is to give people ownership over the wind farms that you're trying to build. And it's already happened. Somewhere like Denmark, there was 100,000, what do they call them? Wind guilds, sort of small-scale local ownership of wind turbines. We can start to do something similar here. And it matches up with that need to deliver investment and a shift of ownership to parts of the country that otherwise haven't seen it. Because where are the windy places you want to build wind turbines? You know, somewhere like the Welsh Valleys, which has otherwise been absolutely abandoned for 20, 30, 40 years, is suddenly a place where you can put the investment there, put it in the hands of local people there, it creates jobs, it creates revenue, and suddenly you're looking at a viable economic place rather than somewhere that, you know, people just shrug their shoulders and walk away from for 20, 30, 40 years now. So there's a shift, and at the heart of that shift is the shift in ownership. So you put all that together, that roughly is, I think, a sort of four-part summary of what Corbynomics or the new economics is about. That is the fairly practical and political end of it. I'm very happy to answer questions around the sort of theoretical or the problems and all the rest of it you might want to raise about that. There is increasingly, I think, a sort of theoretical or a theorization of all of this stuff. And bear in mind, a lot of this is as you go along, as you try and make a movement work, as you try and think about what a programme for government looks like, that's where it's developed. So I think there's an interesting sort of questions around the theorization of these things, but that's roughly the four parts of the thing. So it's end austerity, investment, ownership, and that's the three, yes. In fact, that is the three parts rather than the four parts that you really need to pick up on at that point. But those are the three things, and I'm happy to answer questions around it there. Thank you.
Does anyone have any burning questions? So I can get the discussion started.
I wanted to ask, do you have any response or thoughts on the criticism, the worry that people have that that the very rich and those big businesses that you're wanting to tax will just leave the country if Labour get in, and you can't really stop them doing that? Is there any way around that?
Do you want to do a few, or should I do one at a time? Yeah, so do three or something? Yeah.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. I'm sorry if you mentioned this and I just missed it, but I was curious, so how would we decide which sort of regional ownership programs get set up and how much sort of various regions, like how do we decide sort of how does the government decide how much to spend on each of these and what kinds of projects get set up? And in doing that, is part of the purpose also then to contain the private sector? And I'm just wondering if you can say things about what you think sort of the value of a private sector, you know, what the value of a private sector is and sort of on what terms it should operate.
I have a question about the media that kind of ties in with the first question. And it's just kind of like broad, in what ways do you think the media is and isn't set up for the discussion of new economic ideas? In what ways does it fall into the kind of trap of sort of like sound bites and this kind of thing? You know, how do you respond to something like all the billionaires are going to leave the country, etc.? Do you give a long form response, or do you give a very kind of flippant or sort of short response to it?
Okay, I'll take those three. Then just trying to get something up. On the first one, I mean, what do you do if the very rich threaten to leave and all the rest of it? Well, look, the best studies we have, the most recent one anyway, is from Gabriel Zuckman. This is an entirely empirical study of, and it's a good test case, which is variations in taxes amongst US states. If you're in the US, you're in one country, right? So the variation amongst the states is fairly minimal. And there's an assessment of what happens to the movements of rich people when taxes on the wealthy varied amongst US states. And what he found was that actually people move very, very little. Like wealthy people tend not to be very mobile. There is a very simple reason for this. The simple reason is that why are you wealthy? Like to an extraordinary extent, most of the reason why you're wealthy is because of where you are, and you have a network of people you can relate to, you know about how to work there, you know how the system works. You are wealthy because of where you are. If you move somewhere else, you will be less wealthy. And for most rich people, this is simply the case, right? For the absolute super rich, for your genuine billionaires, for the 0.001%, then suddenly you're on another planet and they're all floating around somewhere else. And that is where you need to start to get serious about offshore property companies or various other forms of offshore tax avoidance and sophisticated schemes you can use if you're a billionaire who's determined not to pay tax. But that's a slightly different question to whether or not people are here or not. If you're talking about companies and whether they can move elsewhere, we know already that companies can attempt to locate across the world. They can be mobile in a legal sense. We know that if, I don't want to pick specific examples as like bad examples, but you could pick a large tech company who decides to locate itself in Ireland and claim that it's making its money there because it's cheaper to do this in tax terms than to locate where it's actually making its money. The challenge, and it's, in many senses it's not that difficult to challenge because you can see how you might plausibly solve it, is that if you're a large tech company claiming you're making money in Ireland, you're very obviously actually selling things, or at least you are making your money because of your presence in other parts of the world. So the challenge becomes, how do you levy a tax on that presence in other parts of the world? What's interesting at the minute is that discussion at the OECD, and quite close to reaching some agreements about how you might do this, is that we are close to achieving, I think, a kind of consensus on how to tax mobile, particularly legally mobile, multinational companies in a way that's appropriate to how they are now, rather than how they were in the 20s and 30s when much of the tax system was devised. So I think there's a kind of international consensus movement there, based on the fact that if you are a large company, you still need to make money somewhere. You still need to go somewhere and sell something. And as soon as that happens, it is, at least in principle, possible to tax a thing. Britain is a very large economy. You can say, I as a company no longer want to be here, but you're still going to have to try and sell things here because it's a large economy full of basically pretty well-off people to whom you're trying to sell something. That's still going to happen. What's also interesting, and this is probably a deeper issue about the structure of capitalism, where things are going on this, is that if you take this kind of high period of globalization, if you look at the sort of period from, let's say, roughly the end of the 70s, 78 through to 2008, that sort of convenient 30-year patch, where you had genuinely mobile physical capital, you could genuinely say it is simply cheaper to produce this thing over in the Far East somewhere than it is to produce it in, well, take your pick, in the northeast of England. If you're shipbuilding or something like this, you just move it somewhere else. That genuinely happened. What's happened over the last certainly the last 10 years or so, is the pure cost advantages in producing elsewhere in the world are closing. Take manufacturing wages in the far south of China. The gap between what you get paid per hour as a manufacturing worker in skilled manufacturing worker in Shenzhen is not that far off what you might get in Greece or Portugal at this point in time. That gap is closing. So the pure cost advantages are changing. The types of investment you have to make to do manufacturing or to make it workable on a scale that you can sell to markets, I think, is changing. That the introduction of new technologies, particularly digital manufacturing technologies, 3D printing being the paradigm example, reduces your minimum efficient scale. You no longer really just need, like Foxconn has, a factory of 400,000 people. I mean, they're still there. But it's no longer necessary to have that to be at the cutting edge of what capitalism can do. You can have a far smaller scale of production, at which point locating near markets that you want to sell to is actually something of advantage. And this is still a big consideration for major volume manufacturers. If you want to locate a car plant, there's a good reason to do it in Europe somewhere because you're next to the market you're trying to sell to. This is still a consideration. That consideration is moving more and more. Reshoring is a thing that happens. So in a physical sense, lots of capital is not as mobile as it might once have been, right? The world economy that we're in is not quite as mobile as it used to be. If you take the most mobile bit of the global economy, if you take finance capital, and this is what's really extraordinary, which for years and years, high point of globalization, finance capital goes where it wants. It gets bigger and bigger and it dominates everything and it determines what governments can do, because if you don't do what financial markets want, you're done for. Right? That's the story. That's what drives, it's a major part of what drives New Labour. The negative version of New Labour is you just have to do these things because otherwise the bond vigilantes will get you and all this sort of thing. And it sort of applies. You can see it sort of applies during this high period of globalisation. Take the period again, 78, 2008 or roughly thereabouts. The world economy grows. Global trade grows faster than the world economy. Global financial flows, cross-border financial flows, grow even faster than that. If you take the period from 2008, the world economy has grown a bit, world trade has grown much less and sometimes shrunk. Global financial flows are now down 60% of what they were in 2008. Right? So there's this big sort of change in how globalization operates. It's not what it was. So in other words, capitalism itself is sort of shifted and changed since then. So that threat that used to be there about very mobile capital will just go somewhere else. I think a number of reasons isn't quite there. That was quite a long answer, but we got to the point. On the regional ownership and who decides how to invest, which is a really critically important question, because like Britain doesn't have a very good answer to that. Britain is basically one of the most centralised societies or economies in the global north. I mean, 95% of local authority funding comes directly from government. There's almost nowhere else, perhaps Japan, that has that kind of level of local authorities being reduced to just being a kind of service provider and completely dependent on what the central government does. And this is the legacy of Thatcher. This is a completely deliberate attempt to smash up attempts to claim a local autonomy in the 80s, which we've lived with ever since. The trouble with that is that it just ends up with a very, very centralised decision-making machine in which the bias of investment decisions at the centre is overwhelming relative to whatever needs might be perceived in the periphery. And believe me, once you're outside of London and the Golden Triangle, you're pretty much in the periphery. I was trying to look up the figures, but IPPR had them. And it's not, the transport spending per head in London is a good 5 times what it is in Yorkshire. Right? And that's planned transport head spending. And that's per head. So it's taking account of population differences. So there's incredible bias towards the centre. So what you need is mechanisms to try and break that up. The one that I think is central in Labour's plans is simultaneously the National Investment Bank and a network of regional development banks and a regionalisation of the supply of capital and putting those institutions in the hands of people in those regions. Regions broadly defined, I mean, you can either take the existing administrative regions or not, but regions broadly defined as a subnational functioning economic unit that could exist, some way for people to work together. If you put that in with the idea that the scale that you now need to operate in capitalism is not what it was, that you can plausibly have, and this is happening, it's kind of community-owned 3D printing, and it's economically viable. You scale that up a bit, you're at a regional level. And you have the institutions that can supply that capital on a regional level, suddenly you can see, potentially, how these things join up, and you have quite a restructured economy. That it is a transfer of wealth and power to parts of the country that really haven't seen a transfer of wealth and power like this, probably since the Industrial Revolution, which was a transfer of wealth and power in its own way. So that is how those elements start to fit together. I think there is a broader question of constitutional reform and what kind of representation you have outside of the Westminster Parliament, inside of England, but that's one for a different talk and another day perhaps. There was another question that you asked which I've written down and then can't read my own writing on, which is
media and new economic ideas.
That was one, thank you. Yes, it does say media. That is hugely challenging because I think there's a good book by Mike Berry, the name which escapes me, on how the austerity consensus, which has held for a good long period of time, nearly 10 years, was developed in Britain and the role the media played in that. It's what Simon Wren-Lewis, who's an emeritus professor now of economics at Oxford, calls media macro. This extraordinarily, basically stupid set of ideas, which say the economy is like a household, that the debt is the worst thing that can possibly exist, the deficit is the worst thing that can possibly exist, and every question you have must be fixated on that. The Institute of Fiscal Studies, by the way, does also have this way of thinking. It's shifting, I think, a little bit, but at the heart of what some fairly serious now institutions say about how the economy operates, that mode of thinking is there. And what it means in practice is that you just don't understand how the economy operates. You do austerity in an economy that's been bashed by this enormous recession, which is literally, in pure macroeconomic management terms, the worst possible thing you could do. There is no other thing you could do that was worse than that, apart from possibly whacking up interest rates as well, just for the sheer joy of it. You didn't manage to do this. So every macroeconomics textbook will tell you not to do that. The media communication, this is entirely the opposite. How do you crack through that? My own, some of it is just banging your head against a brick wall. How is the consensus on austerity broken down? It was banging a head against a brick wall until it broke down, right? The more serious answer is the effects of austerity are now so obvious, it's just hard to construct an argument for it when you can see that homelessness is up, 120% in the last few years? It's really difficult to make an argument for austerity work at that point in time. It's really difficult to make an argument for austerity work when, after years of things getting worse, you can visibly see some people are better off. Or like that sense that something is not working here is what sort of drives that. So it's very hard to make that political argument work. And then you can, on top of that, I think, And I think we are getting better at doing this, construct fairly sharp, polemical arguments about how society might be better. And I think that's a challenge for the left in particular, and I say this is a room full of mostly sort of students and academics, that for too long the left has been very distant from questions of power, that it could sit in academic institutions especially and critique things, but it never had to develop a proper account of itself or what it might do if it was in government, and at least some of that is being able to explain what it is you would do in government in ways that people understand and want to support. And that is a real challenge for us. Because I think, there's a lot of macroeconomic sort of theory that just doesn't make much sense to people. For instance, like the basic Keynesian story is one that people won't accept. And I think it's quite reasonable that the Keynesian story, that government can spend more money, and then because of the multiplier effect, the economy grows and everybody gets better off, right? I think that's quite a hard one for people to work with, because they got used to a world in which everything is a bit of a zero-sum game. And they got used to a world in which everything's a zero-sum game, because for most people, life has been a zero-sum game. Apparently the economy's grown, most people are worse off. That is a zero-sum game. This is why people don't accept arguments which look like everyone's going to be better off. So I think part of what the left needs to do, always, to get a license to talk about how things might be better, is to say, who is it that's going to pay for this? Who is it that's not going to be quite as well off? So hence you say the 1%, for example, right? So that is setting the story up, so I think you can create something about how things might be better. You have to give people a vision of the future, but you have to make it a credible, rooted, this is how we're going to get there. And that is going to involve, in a zero-sum game, saying, who is it that's going to pay for all these nice things? Should we take another set?
Yeah. There's somebody over there. You wanted the question?
Great talk, by the way.
Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I'd quite like your speculation in terms of how this kind of new economics, if you will, fits into, so central London born and raised, and I work within engineering and manufacturing, and also on a bit of an academic level, particularly with things around robotics and automation and whatever, and that's quite, I think sometimes gets thrown out of proportion a little bit with how sweepingly that's going to come in, particularly affect trades, whether it's your metalworker's backyard and around the corner from terrace houses or, a workshop space. But I guess the years of neoliberalism has meant that the architectural landscape of places like London and Bristol, whatever, particularly spaces that aren't for trades or jobs that are financialised, office-based work, but in terms of kind of having a landscape where people have ownership of things, but at the same time it's actually related to, not to really bring it, but a metal fabricator's yard or something along those lines. How do you see that kind of panning out when so much of London's capital value is based on property, particularly fitting as many people into, tiny blocks of flats?
Yep.
Just your speculation on that would be wonderful.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Question about the relationship between Labour's current policy platform and the whole degrowth agenda, and to what extent they could possibly be reconciled or at least have some kind of conversation at some point.
Okay.
One more if it's going. Another question?
I was wondering, where does central banks fit in? Because central banks since the 70s have been a sort of autonomous part of economic policy making, which have become more autonomous and more powerful with every decade that's passed since the 70s, to the point where they now are effectively responsible for keeping the economy going at all, but also extremely independent. So you've got a sort of centre of extreme technocratic power, also responsible for prosperity, such as it is. What within Corbynomics would John McDonnell do on day one in relation to the Bank of England?
I'll take that. Should I start with yours, Will? I know you better than this, but it feels like one of those questions people ask is like a gotcha, you just
you didn't mention it, that's all.
Yeah. Well, it's good, don't mention it, because I didn't really mention this either. Look, the macroeconomics of Corbynism is extremely boring, right? It's deliberately as dull as possible. It's quite, I said this, I was sitting next to, we got Simon Wren-Lewis and Jonathan Portis, who did a lot of the academic work behind Labour's sort of set of fiscal rules, and it's very good, properly sort of neoclassical, well thought through, very conventional new Keynesian. stuff, and it's rigorous and it works in its own terms and it's a sensible thing to do. But I was sitting next to him the other day and said, "Oh, it's as boring as possible," and realised he was largely responsible for it. But it's deliberately boring, because if you want to say, okay, this is going to be a transformational government, we're going to make some serious changes, and this is going to change, which is that we're going to end austerity, and this is going to change, which is going to sort of rebuild the public sphere. It's going to be like actually quite an expanded version of what a public sphere is. It's going to be universalism. We're going to do all these things. Free broadband, that sort of thing. We're going to invest in lots of places that the British state has not been capable of investing in for a long period of time. We're going to shift ownership. This is all going to look quite different. And I barely even touched, by the way, on some of the changes in the workplace. £10 an hour minimum wage, right? The collective bargaining, the setting up of a, can't remember the name of it, an institute to move towards reductions in working time over the next 10 years or so. You put all that together, what you need is a stable place that you're going to build on. And the stable place you're going to build on is make your macroeconomics as boring as possible and say to people, here is basically 5-10 years over which we're going to borrow this much money, we expect this to happen, and this is how it's going to look like. That's what Labour's fiscal rule does. That also applies to the Bank of England. There is absolutely no consideration or question whatsoever that the Bank of England's independence will be touched in any way, shape or form. First one. That doesn't mean that there isn't an argument about what the Bank of England should be doing at any point in time, how its mandate is set. But the minute its mandate, which is written by government and given to the Bank of England to carry out, is to say, well, basically that inflation should be 2%, and if it goes plus or minus, it's a symmetrical target, so it's plus or minus 1% either way, the governor has to write, it's 0.5% either way, the governor has to write a letter to the Chancellor explaining why this is. And then the Monetary Policy Committee makes its decisions on interest rates based on trying to follow that mandate. And that's it. Now, you could write a different mandate. The Federal Reserve, America's, US's central bank, has a mandate which also includes the idea that they're going to promote jobs growth. The challenge there is how much weighting do they apply to these things. But nonetheless, you can write a different mandate. We will be writing, and there will be an attempt to write a different mandate for the Bank of England. And there have been a number of suggestions about what that might include. But to me, this is the heart of what the problem of a central bank is under capitalism. If you're saying we want to change all these institutional structures and fundamentally restructure the economy over here, but we want to keep this stable, that mandate has to reflect doing that. It has to reflect something like, over the next 10 years, we're going to decarbonise the economy. Therefore, the Bank of England mandate should include some recognition of that, and that's what we're going to do. It's almost like a programming problem rather than a political problem. You want to be able to just write out these are the things and give it to the Bank of England, off we go. Right? That's how we should look at it. And people, there's a bit at the left that gets very het on that. You must take control of the Bank of England. Not at all. Park it. Sit it there. Give it a list of things to do. Expect it to carry out those things, and then we'll carry on. Right? That's how the macroeconomics of all this sort of plays out. Right. I'll come back to. I'll take the labour and degrowth one as the last case in this. Yeah, the space. Well, look, the space question is absolutely integral to all of this. Britain is, United Kingdom, I should say, is the most geographically unequal country in the European Union by some distance. Right? It is exceptionally geographically unequal in terms of GVA, gross value added per person. If you take a sort of standard European-wide division of the geography of each country in Europe, it has basically the richest place in the whole of the EU, which is again over the river. It's more or less the city of London, and it has some places that if you go to the Welsh valleys or Wirral, they kind of vie for the absolute sort of poorest part, are comparable to Bulgaria or Romania, in terms of how much they produce. Now that's in one country. That's an incredible spread. What is it? 75% or thereabouts. 70% of areas and regions in Britain earn below the European average. Right. At the same time as you've got the richest. If you took London out of Britain, it would be one of the poorer countries in the EU. Right? This is an incredible thing that's happened here. So the question of space, I think, is integral. I mean, quite a broad sense of space is integral. Space and sense of geography is integral to what you want to do here. Addressing that properly, I think, means recognising two different forms of spatial crisis. The crisis in London, the sharp end of the economic crisis in London is a crisis of housing. The crisis in much of the rest of the country is a crisis of work or a crisis of jobs. And these two work together, they kind of play off each other. And the way you resolve them, I think, is you create lots of jobs in the rest of the country, and you create lots of houses one way or the other in London, and that's the kind of the solution to it. But that does imply a spatial redistribution of where output is taking place. So it also means you have to have very big investment programs. You do things like Crossrail for the north, linking up Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, Hull, that sort of thing. You also deliver that investment to local and regional institutions so they can start to put things together themselves. You start to make that happen, you shift the economic geography of Britain away from this insane sort of concentration of power and wealth in London, which for most people in London doesn't work for them. For a few people it works very well. If you're rich in London, it's fantastic, which is why rich people keep coming here. They like it here. If you're pretty much everyone else, it's kind of a bit grim, and everything's a bit expensive, and it's a bit miserable at best. So it doesn't really work for anyone. So you redistribute economic power and wealth to the rest of the country, you ease the pressure in London, you change how the whole economic geography of Britain operates, and you're in a very different world. You have potentially independently functioning regions in a broadly sort of global world economy rather than everything is basically an adjunct of London. That's a big picture thing. On the smaller scale bit of what do you do with these spaces, I think you can genuinely start to see, and it is starting to happen. Someone like Preston is already, it's a very good Labour council there. Jamie Driscoll has just been elected he's the Metro Mayor of Tyne, north of the Tyne, up in the northeast, or Newcastle, north of the Tyne, I think the name is. With quite ambitious programmes to getting small-scale manufacturing, this sort of thing. There are community-owned 3D printing places starting to pop up. There are maker spaces. We can start to repurpose some of these things, particularly where we have a very large, very solid building stock in Britain. There's no reason to knock it all down. You could turn it into something better. That's partly why you have a programme to insulate everybody's home. There's no reason to knock it all down. It's just very wasteful. But if you insulate everybody's home properly, you save on carbon emissions, you save them electricity bills, and you create many, many tens of thousands of jobs over a long period of time. So there is this element of repurposing space. But it has to be put in the context of the big geographical question of how do you repurpose the economic geography of the entire country. So you shift things out of London, you put them elsewhere, and you suddenly start to see a bit of life in the rest of the country. Fitting into that, Labour and degrowth. I mean, look, if you take Labour's programme over the 10 years, I can't remember quite who asked it, but somewhere at the back, thank you. You take Labour's programme over the 10 years, we need to decarbonise rapidly. If you're saying 2030-ish, sort of areas where you want to get to, then that implies a very, very great deal of investment. And you need to front load this investment, by the way. If you're chasing a sort of zero carbon, net zero target, exactly, and you're working to a carbon budget, it's better to do this now rather than try and rush at the end. So you front load massively. So to be honest with you, the early years of this programme look like a massive increase in growth, right? Huge. Because if you're going to spend £400 billion over 10 years of capital spending, and you're going to try and front load at least some of that, this is an incredible increase in growth. If nothing else happens, you're going to get this. What happens after that point, once you get through the first 5 years and into the 10 years? I would say, look, I think we can have a level of indifference. We ought to have a broader concept of what an economy does and just go, here's GDP, does it go up, does it go down? For 10 years, GDP has more or less gone up. For most people, living standards have gone down, right? And people see this. So this number doesn't work anymore. The promise of GDP has disappeared. We have to think about something else. Great ways of what we do anyway don't really contribute to GDP. We all know that because you don't pay for most stuff that you actually enjoy doing. That's the first one. You don't pay for most stuff that you actually don't enjoy doing, like housework and that sort of thing. But there's also great chunks of things that you don't pay for that are clearly an economic activity. When look at Facebook. What does it say when you log on? It's free and it always will be. That isn't contributing to GDP. There's something else going on. There's a whole other conversation to have about what that something else is. But the direct process there, the transactions disappear. So GDP is decaying as a useful measure. And behind that, the sort of idea of making this magic number go up as a goal for government, I think, is decaying. So that gets you into a really good, useful conversation about purpose of the economy. Why do we have an economy that works anyway? And really that's a question about why do you have a society that works anyway? And that's a really big, like properly philosophical, what kind of society we want to live in, what's our version of good society question. If we can get to that conversation in terms of talking about economics, I'll be very, very happy. I think it'll be a massive improvement in where we are at the minute. More?
Any more questions?
I have one more. Also, thanks by the way. Thanks, it's a really good talk. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask if you could go into the Labour policy on debt a little bit and thinking personal debt.
Yeah.
Because as I understand it, the financial crisis was, the effects of that were partially sucked up by personal debt, and the creation of moving and holding of that being profitable.
Yeah.
Is there anything to do with like debt write-offs like change in ownership regarding debt.
Should I just come back to it straight away, or is there another one? I'll come back on that one straight away, which is, yeah, you're right. I mean, look, there's sort of, Grace Blakely's book is very good in this, Stolen, which is the short version is, why did we end up with a financial crisis? Basically because we stacked up loads and loads of debt and it ran ahead of how fast the economy was going to grow and anybody's ability to repay it. So for a period of time, you can have a version of debt-led growth. You can say to someone, okay, you don't have very much money really, but here is some debt, now you can buy things. If you're going out to buy things, the economy will grow faster and everything will look all right for a while. Trouble is with debt, at some point you have to repay it. That's kind of fundamental to how debt operates. If you find, and this is kind of what happens from 2006 onwards, if you find large numbers of people can't repay their debt, it starts to become a problem for the people who gave them the debt. If there's only one or two people who can't repay their debt, that's a problem for them and who cares, right? In a global sense, banks don't, whatever, you're screwed, that's your lookout. If everybody starts to default all at once, that's an actual economic crisis, and that's the difference. So what happens in 2008 is lots and lots of people can't repay their debt because that process of debt-led growth had gone on for so long. We had debt running ahead of incomes to the point where Britain was, by 2007, 2008, pretty much the most heavily indebted, at least British households were the most heavily indebted of any major developed economy. Right? This is unsustainable, and the thing crashes. What happens after 2008, one of the drivers of the recession is that people basically try and repay that debt. And that's why you have very, very, actually shrink economy for a while, very weak growth and this sort of thing. What's started to happen in the last few years is this peculiar shift where incomes haven't really picked up. Household incomes barely picked up. Real wages on the official measures are below what they were in 2008. But there's still some spending taking place. Some of that is a result of inequality. Some people have a lot of money, a lot of people don't. Increasingly, some of that is debt, and because it's hard to get hold of mortgages and this sort of thing, a lot of it is very, very insecure debt. It's unsecured lending. So that can be anything from credit cards all the way through a sliding scale to sort of payday loans and just loan sharking. More and more people are getting into this. Unsecured lending is rising, or was at least a few months ago, rising at the fastest rate since 2008. It's reaching record levels in nominal terms, at least. That's quite a serious issue on a personal basis. It may or may not turn into a systemic sort of debt crisis issue, in the sense that the scale of it isn't as big as it was in 2008. Unsecured lending is still smaller than housing debt, which was the trigger for 2008. If you want to look for a debt trigger, then you need to look at probably very, very unsafe corporate loans and collateralized loan obligations and forms of securities developed out of that. That's a more likely place where a debt crisis might blow up this time around, but that's a slightly different question. So Labour does have some fairly sort of micro-level policies to try and manage debt, like caps on credit, the amount you pay on your overdraft, caps on credit card lending, basically fairly small scale, your basic reformist, how do you stop people doing that? But if you want to break getting themselves into really, really problematic forms of debt at least. If you want to break the process, you need to get more money into most people's pockets. So you need to start talking about things like whacking up a minimum wage. So suddenly people are paid more, right? So you have a £10 now minimum wage, it's a transfer of money into people's pockets, they spend more, they don't have to rely on debt. You have to talk about things like building council housing, so that actually you don't just need to go off and get a mortgage, you can get a decent house without that, and you don't have to massively extend this mortgage in order to get a house at all, or not, as you find with large numbers of young people, you can't even get a mortgage. So you start to build these things up, you start to reduce the costs of people, give them free broadband, you reduce the cost of transport, you push up people's wages, it's a transfer of income back into the hands of most people, that reduces debt dependency, that breaks this cycle of debt-led growth. So that's the bigger sort of picture end of it, I'd say.
We've probably got time for a couple more questions, if there's any. Yeah.
So thank you for the talk. I think today you touched on the IFS, but
Yep.
they mentioned that neither the Conservative or the Labour plans were feasible, and that actually it's not fully costed, and they will have to increase tax and borrowing. So what would your response be to that?
Well, the IFS takes an incredibly sort of conservative view of small c, right? It's not at all politically sort of biased like that, but it takes a fiscally conservative view of what's possible. It doesn't operate, it isn't really set up to do sort of macroeconomic modelling. So when they say things like, and this matters, because when you say something like, okay, your corporation tax increases, so the Labour plan is to increase corporation tax to its level of, 19 pence to 26 pence, up to the giddy heights it was under George Osborne, by the way, 2011. They say, okay, in the short term, that will get you more money in. In the long term, this will reduce investment, because who's going to want to invest here when you have a corporation tax that's below the G7 average? It's kind of nonsense, but that's their story. In order to demonstrate that, you'd have to do a proper macroeconomic modelling exercise, because at the same time, Labour's also saying we're going to invest loads and loads of money, and we know there's a multiplier effect on that at the very least, and it will probably have an impact on productivity over the long term. So we think actually we will get those corporation taxes back in, because the economy will grow, it will be more productive, and therefore your fear that investment won't happen because of this micro impact of tax rates going up is washed out by the bigger macroeconomic impact. So in other words, their fiscal conservatism comes from this kind of micro view of how the economy operates. If they did a proper macroeconomic modelling exercise, and they don't, that would be less of a claim on their part. So when they say that Labour can't possibly do this, I'd say they're wrong, because they have to take the Labour programme as a macroeconomic intervention, not simply as a set of tax and maybe spending changes as well. Yeah. So that's where I think they're going off in a not necessarily very helpful direction at this point. What I would like from the IFS is firstly that they need to be less definitive about what they say. They're treated rightly on the basis of microeconomic work as like authoritative, but their authority in microeconomics transfers into their authority to pronounce on government or potential government programmes, and there it's much more shaky. So it'd be good if they're treated less like the voice of God. It'd be good if the IFS pronounced less authoritatively, which I think they are doing, in fairness to them. And I think it'd also be good to have more than one Institute of Fiscal Studies, because you're all doing PP at Goldsmiths, or some of you are, right? Economics is plural. There is more than one way of doing this. There is more than one methodology. We can't just sit there and say, okay, this is economics with a capital E, this is all there is to it. This is the economy, this is how we understand it. It's nonsense. Right? Economics is mostly quite dull if you just think it's going to be like one way of doing things. The only reason to do economics, personally speaking, is basically it's a bit of maths, but mostly it's an argument, right? That's why it's fun. So actually we ought to be having more than one Institute of Fiscal Studies, providing more than one analysis, and that ought to be the way that the party's manifestos are assessed, and we'll get lots of different answers, and that will give you a better sense of what's going to happen than like, here is the voice of the absolute authority, it is unfeasible, it cannot happen.
Last question. No pressure, we're going to be hanging around for drinks as well, so I'm sure James would take a casual question or two of drinks. Yeah.
I wanted to know more about the climate jobs, which are mentioned in the manifesto, like clarification about what the meaning behind the climate jobs, and if they're going to be attractive they're going to be attractive for who they're going to be attractive.
Okay, this is, the issue here is an interesting one. This is why I sometimes feel that calls for full employment as a demand of the left don't work in the economy where you've got, what is it, British unemployment now? It's 3 and a bit %. It's the lowest it's been since the mid-1970s, maybe earlier. Right? It's getting very close to a perfectly reasonable definition of full employment. So calls to just create loads of jobs. It's like the economy's already creating loads of jobs. The problem you've got is that they're just really bad jobs, like great swathes and really bad jobs. There's incredible statistics on this and people's perception. Fear of unemployment is now higher in polling than it was in 1983 when unemployment was pushing like 3-4 million. Unemployment's fallen off, but people are more frightened of it. They're more frightened of it because the jobs are more insecure, and if you do become unemployed, it's completely miserable, even relative to what it was in the 80s, because you've got nothing and you have to fight for it, right? So that is the issue. Specifically on the jobs, it's the issue of quality of jobs. You're not just saying to people, okay, we'll give you loads of jobs. You want to say, look, we don't have to have jobs which is like a 0-hour contract. You don't know whether you're working one day to the next. You don't have to just go and skivvy around in Sports Direct warehouses. And Shirebrook is a classic example, by the way. Shirebrook is a former mining town village, with some pits nearby, all of which closed. Now, mining is a kind of pretty grim job, frankly, but it was secure and it was relatively well paid, certainly by the early 80s. That's all gone, and what gets replaced is these sort of very, very dubious warehouse work on 0-hour contracts, agency work of the worst sort with the most horrible conditions. There's still jobs there. It's not unemployment in the sense you might think in the 80s sort of model of like everyone's mass unemployment is terrible. There's still jobs there. The economy since 2008 has created loads of jobs, but it's the quality of jobs you have to drive through. That's at the heart of saying let's have green jobs, because what you're saying is that one, the work will be good in the sense of necessary. You will be doing good work. It will be fulfilling. You will be taking part in something that's big and important. 2, it will be secure because this is a 10-year programme to decarbonise the economy, so that's the length of time it lasts for. Here's the government putting the money into it. 3, you will have proper representational work, proper standards of work, and these are the guarantees we're going to give to you. Now, the challenge, I think, at this point in time, is getting to the point where people can raise their sights and see that this is achievable. Because I think if you're dealing with lots and lots of places where basically you've had nothing like that for a very, very long period of time, saying to people, this is a rich country, we have challenges to overcome, climate change could be the thing that creates a new green industrial revolution where you are, there could be decent jobs for everybody, this is a vision of what it looks like. That's the hard part in saying to people, we do that. That's the hard part, I think, on doorsteps right now and saying, look, this is what Labour wants to do, this is how it can work. Because people have spent so long being battered in great swathes in the country where they just don't think of jobs like that. They don't think that they can have something better. We have to lift people's sights, I'd say. And that, I think, is the heart talking about green jobs. That's what it means to talk about.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we'll conclude at that. Round of applause for